For a moment, James's thoughts drifted to Ashley. The echoes of her warning, spoken so earnestly in that hospital room, came back to him. Somehow his daughter had seen the danger before he had. He resolved to involve her more closely in the fight ahead. This wasn't just about saving the company, it was about safeguarding the legacy he hoped to pass on to her. James opened his eyes, his resolve hardening. Betrayal might have shaken his foundation, but it would not define his future. There was a battle ahead, and he intended to win it not just for himself, but for the values he had built joint stock upon. James Thomas couldn't shake the image of the young nurse from his mind. Her earnest eyes, brimming with urgency, haunted him as clearly as her words. "Don't go to that meeting," she had said. How could she have known? The question clung to his thoughts, refusing to let go. With a determined breath, James picked up his phone and dialed the hospital where he had recently been a patient. "Mountsea Hospital, how may I assist you?" A cheerful voice greeted him. "This is James Thomas," he began, his tone steady but tinged with impatience. "I'm trying to contact a nurse who cared for me during my stay. Her name is Emily." A brief pause followed, accompanied by the faint sound of typing. "I'm sorry, Mr. Thomas, but we don't currently have a nurse by that name on staff." James frowned, leaning back in his chair. That can't be right. She was there just this morning. Brown hair, petite, probably in her late 20s or early 30s. "I understand, sir," the receptionist said carefully, "but I'm looking at our roster, and there's no one named Emily listed. Could it be possible you misread her name tag?" "No," James replied firmly. "I'm certain her name was Emily. Could you check again? It's important." The receptionist's tone softened, sensing the urgency in his voice. "Of course, Mr. Thomas. Let me double-check with our HR department. Please hold." The faint strains of hold music filled the line, but James barely noticed it. His mind raced with possibilities. Had he misunderstood something? Imagined her? No, Emily had been too vivid, her words too deliberate. Her warning had not been the vague pleasantries of a stranger. It had been specific, personal, and deeply concerned. The receptionist returned, her voice tinged with apology. "Mr. Thomas, I spoke with HR. They've confirmed there's no one named Emily currently employed here. Could it be possible you encountered her at another hospital?" "Thank you for checking," James replied, his frustration barely masked. He ended the call and stared at his phone, the weight of confusion settling over him like a heavy fog. Determined to find answers, James turned to his computer. He pulled up the hospital's website, scanning through pages of staff photos. Each image brought a flicker of hope, only to extinguish it when none matched the nurse he remembered. "No, Emily." It was as if she had vanished, leaving nothing but the echo of her warning. James leaned back in his chair, his hand brushing his chin as his thoughts churned. Had she been a temporary hire, someone from an agency? Or was there another explanation entirely one far stranger? The room felt smaller, the walls closing in as the mystery deepened. James Thomas, a man who thrived on control and logic, now found himself grappling with something intangible, something beyond the realm of his usual calculations. Emily, or whoever she was, had appeared when he needed her most. And now, just as swiftly, she was gone. A soft knock at the door pulled James Thomas from his swirling thoughts. His assistant Emily stepped inside, her expression shadowed by concern. "Mr. Thomas, there's someone here to see you," she said cautiously. "She says it's urgent." James felt his chest tighten. Could it be Ashley? He leaned forward, his voice steady but laced with anticipation. "Is it a young woman named Ashley?" Emily shook her head. "No, sir. It's MS. Winters, Elena Winters." James's brow furrowed deeply. Elena Winters, the eldest member of his board and someone he had long trusted as a mentor, was the last person he expected or wanted to see right now. Her involvement in the betrayal still stung fresh, a wound barely concealed beneath his steely composure. "Send her in," he said, his voice even but firm. He braced himself for another confrontation, the turmoil of the day simmering just below the surface. The door opened wider, and Elena entered with a hesitance that was wholly uncharacteristic of her. Gone was the confident stride he had come to associate with her. Instead, her movements were slow, burdened by what seemed to be the weight of regret. "James," she began softly, her voice carrying a tremor he'd never heard before. "I owe you an explanation." James leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled under his chin, his eyes, sharp and unyielding, locked onto hers. "I'm listening," he replied, his tone measured, "though I'm not sure what you could say that would justify what's happened." Elena hesitated for a moment, then sank into the chair opposite him. Her usual aura of authority had been replaced by a vulnerability James found disconcerting. She met his gaze with a mixture of regret and resolve, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I've made mistakes," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Grave ones. But I need you to know I never intended for it to spiral like this." James raised an eyebrow, his skepticism evident. "Mistakes? Elena, what you and the others have done goes beyond mistakes. It's betrayal, pure and simple." Elena flinched at his words but pressed on, her voice growing steadier as she continued. "When you were in the hospital, there was panic among the board. Your absence made some of us question the future of joint stock. I let fear cloud my judgment. When Joseph approached us with the idea of aligning with Adam Boyd in global communications, it seemed like a necessary contingency plan." James's jaw tightened. The mention of Joseph Sullivan and Adam Boyd reignited the smoldering anger he had worked to keep in check. "So your solution was to align with our greatest competitor? To sell out the very company I built from the ground up?" His voice, though calm, carried the unmistakable edge of betrayal. Elena shook her head vehemently. "It wasn't supposed to go this far. I swear, James. I thought I could keep things in check, maintain your vision while addressing the board's concerns. But Joseph, he took things further than any of us anticipated." James studied her carefully, searching her face for any sign of deceit. Elena's remorse seemed genuine, but the damage was done. "You were one of the few people I trusted implicitly," he said, finally, his voice heavy with disappointment. "And now, here you are, sitting across from me, admitting that you played a role in undermining everything I've worked for." Elena's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm here because I want to help make this right. I've brought documents proof of Joseph's dealings with Adam Boyd. They detail everything, James. I should have come to you sooner." She reached into her bag and pulled out a folder, sliding it across the desk. James hesitated before picking it up. The weight of the betrayal and the potential truth within those pages pressed against him. "You should have," he agreed, his tone cold. "But at least you're here now, for whatever that's worth." Elena nodded, her shoulders slumping with relief. "I'll cooperate with any investigation. Just tell me what you need, James. I owe you that much." James set the folder down and exhaled slowly, the enormity of the situation pressing heavily on him. "Leave the cooperation to Nicole Butler," he said, referencing the investigative journalist he had contacted earlier. "If these documents are as damning as you say, they'll be the cornerstone of the case against Joseph and Adam." Elena rose slowly, her movements tentative. "Thank you for listening," she said quietly. "I'll be ready to help when the time comes." As she exited the office, James sat back in his chair, the folder unopened before him. The day's revelations had left him raw, but one thing was clear: he wasn't going down without a fight. Elena's confession was just the beginning. The storm brewing around joint stock wasn't over, but James Thomas had faced worse odds before, and this time he was determined to win. James Thomas listened intently, his face an impassive mask of control. Despite the turbulence within, he refused to let it show. The words spilling from Elena Winters only fueled the fire of betrayal smoldering in his chest. "It wasn't supposed to go this far," Elena said, her voice cracking under the weight of her guilt. "We thought we were protecting the company, ensuring its survival if you didn't recover." James's jaw tightened, his lips pressing into a thin, unforgiving line. "And protecting the company required clandestine meetings with our largest competitor? Undermining everything we've worked decades to build." Elena's hands trembled slightly as she clutched the arms of the chair. "You have to believe me. When you had that heart attack, it shook us all. It was like staring into the abyss. We realized how dependent joint stock had become on you. Joseph convinced us we needed a contingency plan." Joseph, James repeated, the name tasting acrid on his tongue. "Let me guess, it was his brilliant idea to cozy up to global communications." Elena flinched at the venom in his tone, but shook her head. "No, that came later. Initially, it was just about securing the company's future, creating a leadership structure that could operate without you if the worst happened. But then Joseph began pushing for bolder strategies. He claimed we needed to align ourselves for what was coming." James leaned forward, his piercing gaze locking onto Elena. His voice dropped, icy and deliberate. "And you supported him? All of you went along with this madness?" Elena hesitated, her gaze falling to the floor. "Not all of us," she admitted quietly. "Some of the board had serious doubts, but Joseph was persuasive, and with you in the hospital, he exploited our fear, our uncertainty." James straightened in his chair, his hands gripping the edge of the desk tightly. "Fear," he repeated, his voice thick with contempt. "You let fear dictate your decisions. Instead of standing firm, you chose to betray me, this company, everything we've stood for." Elena's head snapped up, her expression pleading. "It wasn't betrayal, James. It was desperation. We thought we were doing what was necessary to save joint stock. But I see now. I see how far we let things spiral out of control." The silence that followed was deafening, stretching like a chasm between them. James's gaze didn't waver, cutting into her like a blade. For a moment, Elena thought he might shout, unleash the torrent of anger she knew he felt. But instead he spoke, his voice eerily calm. "Desperation doesn't absolve guilt, Elena, nor does it undo the damage that's been done. You've jeopardized the company, our legacy. And for what? A fleeting sense of security." Elena's shoulders sagged under the weight of his words. "You're right," she said softly. "I can't justify what we've done. But I want to make it right. That's why I'm here. I brought everything I could, documents, emails, communications with Global Communications. It's all there." She slid a thick folder across the desk. "This should help you understand the extent of Joseph's dealings. And if it helps expose him, consider it my first step toward redemption." James didn't move to take the folder immediately. His eyes remained fixed on Elena, searching for any sign of duplicity. At last he reached forward, his fingers closing around the edge of the folder. "This isn't redemption, Elena," he said coldly. "It's damage control, but I'll take what I can get." Elena nodded, her voice trembling. "I'll do whatever it takes, James. You have my word." As Elena stood to leave, James leaned back in his chair, the folder resting heavily in his lap. Her words lingered in the air, a bitter reminder of the betrayal that had come from those he once trusted most. The door closed behind her, leaving James alone in the suffocating silence of his office. He stared at the folder for a long moment before opening it. Inside was the proof he needed: the evidence of Joseph Sullivan's betrayal, of the board's complicity, and of Global Communications' predatory maneuvers. James exhaled slowly, his resolve hardening. He would fight this, not just for himself, but for the company he had built with his own hands. The battle ahead would be grueling, but James Thomas wasn't one to back down. With steady determination, he picked up the phone. "Nicole Butler," he said to his assistant. "Get her on the line. It's time the world learned the truth." James Thomas's voice remained measured, each word deliberately controlled. "Why now, Elena? Why tell me this at this moment?" Elena sat a bit straighter in her chair, the weight of regret momentarily replaced by a glimmer of her old resoluteness. She looked at James, her expression a mix of contrition and determination. Because, James, it's not too late to undo this damage. The deal with Global Communications hasn't been finalized yet. If we act swiftly, we can still salvage joint stock. James turned away from her, his hands sliding into his pockets as he walked to the floor-to-ceiling window. The city lights of Washington, D.C., began to flicker in the twilight, a shimmering reminder of the countless people whose lives were intertwined with the decisions made within these walls. What exactly are you suggesting, Elena? His tone was calm, but a current of guarded curiosity ran beneath the surface. Elena leaned forward, resting her hands on the edge of his desk, as if trying to bridge the chasm of mistrust between them. We gather evidence against Joseph, she said firmly. I'll testify about the board's involvement, accept responsibility for my part. With my testimony and the proof we can collect, we'll have enough to remove Joseph and the others who betrayed this company. Together, we can save joint stock. James turned back slowly, his gaze steady as it bore into Elena's. He studied her face, searching for any signs of duplicity. What he saw instead was a mixture of fear and resolve. Beneath the guilt in her eyes, there was also the spark of loyalty he'd once trusted in her. You realize what you're proposing won't be simple, James said at last, his voice low and deliberate. These people know our every move. They've had access to our operations, to everything. Elena nodded, her expression unflinching. I know, James, but I also know this is the right thing to do. I made a mistake, a terrible one, and I'm ready to make amends. Whatever it takes. For a moment, silence hung between them, heavy with unspoken emotions. Then James nodded, his resolve hardening. Very well, he said, his tone decisive. If you're willing to stand by your word, then so am I. We'll fight this together. But understand there's no room for half measures, no chance for hesitation. Once we start, we see it through to the end. Elena exhaled slowly, relief washing over her features. Thank you, James, she said softly. You won't regret this. James didn't respond immediately, his gaze drifting back to the cityscape beyond the glass. Let's hope I don't, he said, more to himself than to her. The room fell silent once more, but this time it was a silence of shared resolve, not lingering doubt. They both understood the battle ahead would test them in ways neither had faced before. But if there was one thing James Thomas had always believed in, it was the power of perseverance and redemption. Let's get to work, he said, his voice firm. We have a company to save. James Thomas leaned back in his chair, Elena's words lingering in the air like an unresolved chord. Despite her sincerity, a sense of unease gnawed at him. His thoughts drifted once more to Ashley, the enigmatic nurse who had risked much to warn him. There was something about her that seemed intrinsically tied to the chaos unraveling around him, a missing link in the tangled web of deceit threatening everything he'd built. All right, Elena, James said at last, his voice calm but firm. I'll give you the chance to make amends. But let me make one thing very clear. If I find even a shadow of further betrayal, I will use every ounce of my resources to bring down everyone involved. Do you understand me? Elena's face softened with relief. Crystal clear, James. I promise you, I won't fail you again. Thank you for giving me this chance. She stood and walked toward the door, her gait steadier than when she entered. James watched her go, his expression unreadable, then turned his attention back to the expansive cityscape outside his window. The horizon stretched endlessly, dotted with lights that symbolized countless lives intertwined with his decisions. As the door clicked shut, the day's events finally caught up with him. James felt the weight of exhaustion settle over his shoulders, but he knew there was no time to rest, not yet. The real fight was only beginning. Reaching for his phone, he scrolled through his contacts, pausing when he found the name he needed. Michael Stroud, his most reliable private investigator. The man had proven himself time and again, and James would need him now more than ever. The line connected after a single ring. Mr. Thomas, came Stroud's steady voice. What can I do for you? I need you to start digging, Michael, James said, his tone resolute. There's a conspiracy brewing within joint stock, and I need names, dates, and evidence to prove it. Start with Joseph Sullivan and the board members I'll send you a list of. And one more thing, find a nurse named Ashley Thomas. She's connected to this somehow. I need to know how." "Understood," Stroud replied without hesitation. "I'll report back as soon as I have something solid." As the call ended, James set his phone down, his mind already working through the priorities ahead. He needed airtight evidence to dismantle the scheme orchestrated by Joseph and his allies, and Ashley, her involvement remained a mystery he couldn't ignore. James's instincts told him that whatever secrets she held were pivotal to unraveling the entire conspiracy. But he had no idea how personal or how deeply life-altering those revelations would prove to be. The stakes were higher than they'd ever been. This wasn't just about saving joint stock, it was about protecting the legacy he'd spent his life building and uncovering truths that could redefine his very identity. James stood, his gaze fixed on the city below. The battle ahead would test every ounce of his resilience, every bit of his cunning. But he was ready. Whatever secrets awaited him, whatever challenges lay in his path, he would face them head-on. As the glow of Washington D.C. city lights danced across the glass, James Thomas stood silently by his office window. The night seemed endless, yet filled with a quiet urgency. He was on the cusp of a journey that would challenge everything he had ever believed about his identity, his company, and the people he had relied on for years. The stakes had never been higher. Joint Stock wasn't just a business empire, it was the embodiment of his life's work, his ambitions, and the legacy he had fought to build. The betrayal he had uncovered within its walls threatened not only the company's future, but the very foundation of his trust in those around him. James's mind lingered on Ashley Thomas, the mysterious nurse whose warning had been the catalyst for this unfolding chaos. Her words had been laced with urgency, her concern palpable. Somewhere out there, Ashley held answers he desperately needed, a thread that could unravel the intricate web of deception now suffocating his world. The city below glimmered like scattered diamonds, its rhythm a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside James's mind. He turned away from the view, his reflection briefly catching his eye in the darkened glass, a man driven, yet burdened by the weight of what lay ahead. This wasn't merely about safeguarding Joint Stock from betrayal or dismantling Joseph Sullivan's treacherous schemes. It was about redemption, uncovering the truth, and reclaiming control of the empire he had dedicated his life to creating. James tightened his fists at his sides, resolve hardening like steel. The battles to come would test his resilience and his capacity to navigate a maze of deceit, but he was ready. The betrayal of those closest to him would not be the final chapter of his story. The stage was set for a confrontation that would force him to confront his past and determine his future. Somewhere in the distance, Ashley Thomas held the key to it all. Whatever secrets she carried, whatever truths she would reveal, James was prepared to face them. The fight to save Joint Stock and perhaps himself was just beginning. James Thomas stood at the expansive floor-to-ceiling windows of his office, the first light of dawn casting warm tones of gold and pink across the room. The tranquil hues stood in stark contrast to the storm of thoughts raging in his mind. He gripped the edge of the desk, steadying himself as the weight of betrayal pressed down on his shoulders. The sound of the door opening drew his attention. Joseph Sullivan strode in with a casual confidence that now struck James as calculated. Every move, every word, every glance carefully orchestrated. James Joseph greeted, his polished smile stopping just short of his eyes. "I'm glad you called for this meeting. We need to clear the air." James didn't return the pleasantries. He gestured for Joseph to sit but chose to remain standing. The decision wasn't arbitrary, it was a subtle assertion of control, a silent reminder of whose office this truly was. "I'll get straight to the point," James began, his tone steady but laced with a simmering anger. "I'm aware of the dealings with Global Communications. I'm aware of the board's plans to restructure Joint Stock behind my back. What I don't understand, Joseph, is why. Why would you, of all people, betray me?" Joseph hesitated, the confident facade cracking for just a moment before he recovered. He leaned forward slightly, adopting a tone of practiced sincerity. "Betray you? James, you've got it all wrong," Joseph began, his voice low and measured. "Everything we've done has been for the good of joint stock, for your legacy." James's jaw tightened as he fought to maintain his composure. "My legacy," he echoed, his voice cold. "Are you seriously going to stand there and tell me that colluding with our greatest competitor is about preserving my legacy?" Joseph sighed, his demeanor shifting to one of feigned empathy. "You have to understand the position we were in, James. When you were hospitalized, it sent shock waves through the company. Investors panicked, the board was on edge. There was no clear leadership. We had to act quickly to stabilize the situation. And you thought the best course of action was to go behind my back," James shot back, his words cutting through the room like a blade. "You could have come to me, Joseph. You could have trusted me as I trusted you. We could have faced this together, the way we always have." Joseph's expression darkened, a flicker of frustration crossing his features. "It wasn't that simple, James. You weren't there. The board was on the verge of a complete meltdown. I had to make decisions, hard decisions, for the sake of the company." James stepped closer, his piercing gaze locked on Joseph. "Don't you dare make this about the company. This was about power, about greed, about your ambition. Don't insult my intelligence by pretending otherwise." The room fell into a heavy silence, the tension palpable. The morning sun continued to rise, its warm light illuminating two men who had once been allies, now standing on opposite sides of an irreparable divide. "I gave you everything," Joseph James said, his voice softer now but no less firm. "My trust, my loyalty, my friendship. And you threw it all away. For what? A chance to take my place, a bigger piece of the pie." Joseph's silence spoke volumes. James took a deep breath, his resolve hardening. "You've made your choices, Joseph. Now, it's time for me to make mine." As James turned his back to the man who had once been his closest ally, he knew there was no going back. The battle for joint stock and for the truth was just beginning. Joseph Sullivan shook his head, exasperation edging into his voice. "You weren't there, James. You were in a hospital bed, and none of us knew if you'd pull through. We had to act fast to stabilize the stock prices, to keep contracts from walking out the door." James Thomas paced the office, his footsteps echoing in the tension-filled room. Part of him wanted to believe Joseph's justification, to chalk it all up to a desperate move made in a moment of crisis. But the part of him that had built joint stock from the ground up, the part that had weathered storms and setbacks, refused to be fooled. "And what about the deal with Global Communications?" James asked, spinning to face Joseph. His tone was sharp, each word a challenge. "How does selling out to them protect the company?" Joseph hesitated. That fleeting pause was all James needed to see the truth. It was written plainly across Joseph's face. This wasn't just a crisis response. It was a calculated move, a power grab masked as strategy. "Global approached us," Joseph admitted, his voice measured, almost rehearsed. "They proposed a merger, one that would make us the undisputed leader in the industry. James, think about it, with our cutting-edge innovation and their expansive resources, we could revolutionize the world." James's jaw tightened, his hands curling into fists at his sides. "A merger," James repeated, his voice ice-cold. "Or a takeover. Because from where I'm standing, it looks a lot like you were ready to auction off everything we built to the highest bidder." "It's not like that," Joseph snapped, rising from his chair, his posture defensive. "We'd retain significant control. Your vision, James, your dream for joint stock, it would still steer the company." James laughed, the sound hollow and bitter. "My vision," he shot back, his voice rising with restrained fury. "My vision was never about backroom deals or stabbing friends in the back. My vision was about creating something meaningful, about using technology to improve lives, not line pockets. When did that stop being enough for you, Joseph?" Joseph opened his mouth, but no words came out. The weight of James's accusations hung heavy in the air, leaving no room for rebuttal. James stepped closer, his gaze unwavering, piercing through Joseph like a blade. "You didn't just betray me, Joseph. You betrayed everyone who believed in what we stood for. And that I will not forgive." The room fell silent, the only sound the faint hum of the city beyond the windows. James turned back to the skyline, the glittering lights now feeling more like reminders of battles yet to come than symbols of hope. This wasn't just about reclaiming joint stock. It was about restoring trust, about standing up for the values that had built the company in the first place. And James Thomas wasn't about to let anyone, friend or foe, strip that away. The two men stood in the center of the spacious office, the weight of their shared history pressing heavily between them. The air seemed charged, each word spoken carrying the potential to shatter what little remained of their partnership. Years of collaboration, trust, and shared aspirations hung precariously on the brink of collapse. "What happens now?" Joseph Sullivan asked, his voice low but edged with defiance. His posture was tense, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. James Thomas inhaled deeply, his expression measured as he fought to temper his rising emotions. When he finally spoke, his tone was calm, yet laced with unshakable resolve. "Now, you have a decision to make," James said, his gaze unwavering. "You can help me repair the damage you've caused. Be honest about everything, every underhanded deal, every betrayal, or you can walk out of here and prepare yourself for the fight of your life. But understand this, Joseph, I will not stand by and let anyone, not even you, tear joint stock away from me." Joseph's eyes widened slightly at the sheer force of James's words. For a moment, an almost imperceptible glimmer of respect crossed his face, an acknowledgement of the man he had once admired and followed. "You really think you can win this?" Joseph countered, his voice tinged with disbelief. "The board is already in line with the merger. The groundwork is set, the momentum unstoppable." "Then I'll stop it," James replied firmly, his words carrying the weight of his determination. His voice did not falter, nor did his gaze waver. "I've faced worse odds than this, Joseph. Or have you forgotten how we started this company? Two men with a dream, a pile of debt, and a garage full of half-baked prototypes." Joseph stared at him, the memories clearly surfacing behind his guarded expression. Those early days, the long nights spent troubleshooting flawed designs, the endless hustle to secure funding, it had been the foundation of everything they had built. James took a step closer, his voice softening slightly but retaining its edge. "This company isn't just a business to me. It's the culmination of sacrifices, hard work, and a vision we both once shared. You may have lost sight of that, Joseph, but I haven't. And I'll do whatever it takes to protect what we built, what I built, from being destroyed by greed and short-sightedness." Joseph hesitated, his resolve faltering under James's unrelenting conviction. The silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken words and the gravity of the moment. Finally, James turned away, his attention shifting to the cityscape visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The lights of Washington, D.C. shimmered in the distance, a stark reminder of the countless lives and ambitions entwined with joint stock's fate. "Think about your choice," Joseph, James said, his back to his former friend. "But know this, I won't back down. Not now, not ever." As James stood there, staring out at the sprawling city, he felt the weight of the battle ahead. It wasn't just about business anymore. It was about principle, legacy, and staying true to the values that had guided him from the beginning. No matter the odds, James Thomas was ready to fight. James Thomas's voice carried an unwavering resolve as he addressed Joseph Sullivan. "I've overcome tougher challenges than this, Joseph. Or have you forgotten how we started joint stock? Two guys, a dream, and a garage filled with half-functional prototypes." He took a measured breath, his tone sharp yet controlled. "If I could build this company from the ground up, I can certainly defend it from predators like global communications." For a moment, Joseph seemed ready to argue. But then, his shoulders sagged under the weight of the moment. Defeat or remorse, it was difficult to tell which flickered across his face. "I never wanted it to come to this, James. Believe me," Joseph said, his voice carrying a note of vulnerability. James's gaze softened, just slightly. "I want to believe you, Joseph. God knows I do. But right now, words won't suffice. I need tangible actions. So tell me, are you with me or against me?" The silence stretched between them, laden with their shared history and fractured trust. Finally, Joseph sighed and nodded, his voice barely audible. "What do you need me to do?" Relief surged through James, though he masked it behind his composed exterior. "First, I need every document, email, and shred of evidence connected to global communications. Then, you're going to call an emergency board meeting. We're putting everything out in the open." Joseph nodded again, resignation clear in his eyes. "And after that?" James's expression hardened into a steely determination. "After that, we fight. We fight to save joint stock and everything it stands for. Once the dust settles, we'll reassess where we stand." Joseph turned to leave, his steps heavy with the weight of the task ahead. "One more thing," James called out, his voice slicing through the tense air. "I need answers about Ashley." Joseph froze, his hand gripping the doorknob. "Ashley? What do you mean?" James's piercing gaze didn't waver. "The nurse from the hospital, the one who warned me to avoid the board meeting. Don't act like you don't know who I'm talking about." Joseph turned slowly, genuine confusion flickering across his face. "James, I swear, I have no idea what you're talking about. There wasn't any nurse named Ashley involved in any of this." As Joseph exited the room, James remained motionless, the gears in his mind spinning relentlessly. If Joseph wasn't behind Ashley's cryptic warning, then who was she? And how did she know about the threat looming over him? The question swirled in his thoughts, more tangled and urgent than ever. Yet one thing was clear: he wouldn't stop until he uncovered the truth. James Thomas turned his back to the tense boardroom, his gaze sweeping across the bustling Washington, D.C. skyline outside the expansive windows. The sun climbed higher, casting a golden glow over the city that seemed to mock the storm brewing within the walls of joint stock. The enigma of Ashley Thomas loomed in his mind, an unsolved mystery that only deepened with each passing moment. But for now, James had more immediate fires to extinguish. The atmosphere in the room was taut, every creak of the leather chairs amplifying the silence. James strode purposefully to the head of the imposing mahogany table, his presence commanding. The board members avoided his eyes, exchanging uneasy glances, as though guilty whispers hung in the air. "Ladies and gentlemen," James began, his voice calm but steely, "thank you for assembling on such short notice. I've called this emergency meeting to discuss some rather troubling revelations." His words hung in the air like a storm cloud, thick and foreboding. The faint hum of city life beyond the windows was the only sound, a stark contrast to the suffocating silence inside. Joseph Sullivan, seated to James's right, shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his gaze fixed firmly on the polished tabletop. His usual confidence was conspicuously absent. "It has come to my attention," James continued, his tone unwavering, "that during my recent absence certain decisions were made without my input or approval. Decisions that, had they come to fruition, would irreparably alter the foundation of this company." Eleanor Winters, the board's elder stateswoman, cleared her throat and leaned forward, her lined face a mask of concern. "James," she began cautiously, "I assure you, every action taken was with joint stock's best interests at heart." James's sharp eyes fixed on hers, piercing and unyielding. Was it Eleanor? Was entering clandestine negotiations with global communications for the good of this company? Was plotting a complete restructuring behind my back a show of loyalty and transparency? A collective gasp rippled through the room. The tension thickened, suffocating in its intensity. Adam Boyd, the board member James had caught red-handed with a global communications document, paled visibly. "How did you?" he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. James raised a hand, silencing him with a gesture of finality. "How I came to know is irrelevant. What matters is that I do know. and I'm giving each of you one opportunity. One chance to be honest. Lay everything on the table." Silence fell once more, heavy and oppressive. The board members exchanged furtive, uncertain glances, their guilt evident in every hesitant movement. Each face reflected a silent plea for someone else to speak first, to shoulder the burden of confession. James waited, his steely demeanor unyielding. The clock ticked in the background, each second an eternity. Finally, Joseph Sullivan broke the silence, his voice low and tinged with hesitation. "James," he started, barely above a whisper, as if the weight of his words might crush him. His gaze shifted to the polished table, avoiding James Thomas's piercing eyes. "This isn't what you think." James remained motionless, his expression unreadable, but the intensity in his eyes demanded truth. "Then enlighten me, Joseph. Explain exactly what this is." Joseph swallowed hard, his confidence cracking under the scrutiny. "When you were hospitalized, we were in uncharted waters. The investors were restless, the media was sniffing around, and we felt cornered. Some of us thought." "Some of you," James interrupted, his voice sharp and controlled. "Be specific. Who exactly decided that betrayal was the best way to manage the situation?" Across the room, Adam Boyd flinched, his hand twitching as if he wanted to raise it but lacked the courage. Eleanor Winters shifted uncomfortably in her seat, while others exchanged glances that spoke of guilt and fear. Joseph took a deep breath, his shoulders slumping slightly. "It wasn't betrayal, at least not at first. We thought we were safeguarding the future of joint stock. Discussions began about leadership contingency plans, alternative partnerships, and options we hadn't considered before." James leaned forward, his palms flat against the table, his presence towering over the room, and those discussions led to secret meetings with global communications, led to talks of restructuring the company I built from the ground up. The silence was deafening. James's words hung in the air, heavy with disappointment and unspoken accusations. Eleanor finally spoke, her voice trembling. "James, we were afraid. When you had that heart attack, it felt like the foundation of everything we've built was crumbling. We made wrong decisions. I see that now, but we truly believed we were acting in the company's best interest." James's gaze softened, but only slightly. "You truly believed the best interest of this company was to undermine my trust and make deals with our greatest rival. Did you ever stop to think what would happen when I found out? Or did you assume I wouldn't?" The room fell silent again, each board member drowning in their own regrets and fears. James straightened, his voice calm but unyielding. "I will not let joint stock fall to opportunists, whether external or internal. From this moment forward, consider this your only chance to cooperate. Come clean, provide every detail, and maybe, just maybe, I'll find a way to rebuild this shattered trust." Joseph nodded reluctantly, his expression a mix of resignation and shame. "What do you need from us, James?" James met his gaze, his resolve unshaken. "The truth. All of it. And we start now." The tension in the room eased ever so slightly as the board members began to gather their thoughts, knowing that the path ahead would be fraught with accountability and hard truths. James, however, stood firm, ready to reclaim what was his and protect the legacy he had fought so hard to build.